Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining our Protection of Personal Information Act, POPI webinar this afternoon. Some people call it POPI, some people call it POPIA, the POPI Act, it's all the same thing. But many years ago, when Ridwan and I started working with this act, we all used to call it POPI. So my name is Ira Gunning. I'm a director in the Banking and Finance Department at ENS, and I've been specializing in privacy for about 10 years. And we've realized that quite a few people have done nothing towards POPI compliance yet, and we've got about a month to go. So for that reason, we decided to do this webinar today. I'm quickly going to hand over to Ridwan to introduce himself.
Thanks, Ira. I'm Ridwan Pauda. I'm the head of technology, media, and telecommunications law at ENSafrica. Together with Ira, we head up the data privacy practice at ENSafrica. About 8 years ago, I was also appointed by the United Nations as one of a group of experts to advise the UN on data privacy issues. So despite POPI being relatively new to South Africa, Ira and I have collectively probably 30 years experience in dealing with privacy laws and privacy legislation. We do hope you enjoyed today's very short webinar and look forward to further interaction. Over to you, Ira.
Thank you very much, Ridwan. So without further ado, I'm going to get into 5 things that you should know about POPI. So like I said, we found that quite a few of our clients came to us in the last month or so and said, you know, we thought this thing was never going to kick in. We thought the act was going to be delayed due to COVID-19, so we haven't done much as far as POPI compliance is concerned. We have also found that quite a few of our clients do not know anything about POPI. So this is really a POPI 101. We've got about 1 month to go, 1 day, less than 1 month to go before we have to be compliant. And we are going to spend this hour telling you about the 5 top things that you should be focusing on. So first of all, we're going to discuss POPI, the background and general application of the Act. Where does it come from? Who is POPI's mother? When does it kick in? And when does it apply? We are going to discuss when personal information can be processed, and we're going to run through the 8 processing conditions. Ridwan is going to discuss the role of the information officer and give you a POPI checklist, tell you about our ENS toolkit, and then we'll briefly touch on non-compliance. So let's look at the background. Where does POPI come from? So the genesis of privacy principles would be the OECD guidelines that were published in 1980. So that was the first time we really see proper privacy principles that would later become the conditions or the conditions for lawful processing in POPI. So we had the OECD guidelines, and that was followed by the EU Directive on Data Protection. The EU Directive on Data Protection was replaced by the General Data Protection Regulation, or the EU GDPR, almost exactly 3 years ago in May 2018. So the OECD guidelines would be POPI's grandmother. The EU directive is POPI's mother. The GDPR is POPI's sister. And we've got a lot of sisters throughout the world, including in the rest of Africa. But our legislation is also very unique in that we give effect to the constitutional right to privacy. And because we give effect to the right to privacy in our Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, our Bill of Rights applies to juristic persons too. And for that reason, POPI is very unique because we give protection to human being and to juristic person information. Now, I've already mentioned the clock is ticking because by 1 July, your organization would have to be POPI compliant. And we'll give you a checklist at the end of the session to show what that means. So when does POPI apply? POPI applies when you process personal information in South Africa which is entered into the record, and you are a responsible party. So a responsible party is that controller of the personal information, the person who decides to process personal information, to decide what to collect, what to do with it, and so on. Now, when a responsible party processes that information in South Africa and it's entered into a record, it triggers the application of POPI. So POPI doesn't care whether the person to whom the information relates sits in the USA or in Rwanda or on the moon. We don't care whether the person is a citizen or an illegal immigrant. We care about the fact that personal information is being processed in our country. So what is processing? Processing is literally anything with a verb. Collection, storage, if you delete data, if you destroy it, anything that you possibly do with personal information would be the processing thereof. And we are often asked if POPI is going to apply to our old information come 1 July. And yes, it will absolutely apply to anything you are processing on 1 July. So if you're processing any personal information on 1 July this year, POPI would apply to it. It wouldn't matter if you collected that information 20 years ago or if you are going to collect it after 1 July. Now, what is meant by personal information? The definition of personal information contains a whole list of things, like what I think of you, what you think of me, names, contact details. It refers to things like race and gender, sex, pregnancy, and so on. But it's important to note that this stuff on the list is just data. The way we turn it into personal information that triggers POPI is we relate it to an identifiable person. And this is where POPI is different to our sisters and brothers around the globe. We say this identifiable person can be a living human being or an existing juristic person, such as a company. So personal information can therefore relate to your vendors. It could relate to your customers, whether they are companies or human beings, and certainly to your employees and any contractors you may use. So the application of POPI is very wide. It is important to note that you get two broad categories of personal information in terms of POPI. We get what I call the ordinary personal information, which I've left in black, and it includes some pretty sensitive things, such as my name and my contact details, my financial history, my identifying number, and so on. But then POPI also recognizes red flag information, and POPI calls it special personal information. And that would be things such as race, your sex life, ethnicity, health, religion, belief, medical information, biometric information. So, and that would be things like fingerprints, probably also facial images. And the main difference between the two categories of data would be when it comes to the ordinary personal information, as a general rule, as long as you've got a lawful purpose, you would be able to process it even without consent. Lawful justifications to achieve your lawful purpose would include things like it's necessary to pursue our legitimate interests. We're doing it to pursue or to assist a third party with their legitimate interests. It's in the data subject's legitimate interests. We're giving effect to a contract, or there's a law that says we must or we can. So quite a few grounds to justify us using the ordinary personal information. But the minute we hit the red flag information, our life becomes a lot harder in a POPI world. And there we generally need data subject consent to process that information, unless, again, for example, a law says we can process that information, like the BEE legislation that says we must process race information, the disaster management regulations that stipulate the types of health information that must be processed. So your first thing would always be to check whether you are dealing with personal information. And then your second thing would be, are we actually using ordinary or special personal information? And by the way, if you're processing information of children, kids under 18, all their information would be treated as red flag information. So there you would generally need the guardian or the parent's permission before you process that information. So when can we process information? So POPIA applies to the processing of information in South Africa. What does that mean? It means that you have to comply with 8 conditions of lawful processing. And as a very minimum, that is what you need to comply with. And we can't select 1 or 2 or 3. We have to comply with each and every single processing condition. The first one is accountability. And accountability basically says comply with POPI, and you need to be able to show you comply with POPI if you are called to do so by the regulator or a court. We do that by means of the likes of a data protection policy, a POPI compliance framework. We do training and awareness. We have an information officer, and so on. Processing conditions 2, 3, and 4 all go hand in hand. We must have a lawful purpose for processing somebody's information. Now, that could, for example, be employment, procurement, sale, supply. And then we have to have a lawful justification to allow us to do so. And that is where the likes of legitimate interests come in, consent, giving effect to a contract, and so on. But those are not strong enough if you are processing information of children or special personal information. Now, when you've got your lawful purpose, you need to define what is the minimum information that I would need. What would be the minimum data fields that I would require to give effect to that purpose? If I collect too much information or I use too much information, then I am excessively processing personal information, which is in breach of the processing conditions. Second of all, you can only keep this information for as long as you are permitted to do so in terms of law. When are we permitted to do so? We permit it if we've got consent from the data subject, if a law says we must, and if we've got a lawful business reason to do so. Very advisable to have a record retention policy. And the record retention policy will then set out how long we should keep our information. I see I've got a question here. Is your name personal information, Barry? Very interesting one. The name comes with a bit of a twist. A name is not necessarily personal information. The name is personal information if the name by itself tells you who the person is. For example, if I said President Cyril Ramaphosa, you would know who he is, and that name is already personal information. If a name is more generic, you would need a few other pieces of the puzzle coming with that name to tell you who that person is. For example, Ira Gunning from ENSafrica. Okay, so the processing condition that I generally battle with most when I write legal opinions is further processing limitation, processing condition 4. Now, processing condition 4 says, whatever you do with personal information after you've collected it, albeit direct marketing, storage, whatever you want to do with that, it must be compatible with the reason why you collected that information in the first place. So don't collect information for COVID-19 tracing purposes and then enter it into your database and do direct marketing. So don't surprise the data subject with what you do with their personal information. So those are the first 4 processing conditions. Moving on, and for some reason, my slides have just frozen. Ridwan, oh, there they are moving again. Okay, processing condition 5, information quality. Information quality says your organization must do something to make sure that the information in your possession, all information across the board, is accurate, up to date, and not misleading. And you must update that information as well. So for example, if you send a bulk SMSer out or emailer out and some return undelivered, don't just leave that. Do something to make sure you flag that information is incorrect. If you dial a telephone number and it doesn't work, do something. Check that your employee records are up to date. Check that your vendor records are up to date, customer records, and so on. And that is why it's such a bad idea to keep information for just in case forever. Because if you keep that information for just in case and forever, you still have to comply with the information quality provision, namely processing condition 5. Openness. We need to tell the data subjects certain things. We need to tell them who we are, what information we collect, why we collect that information, who we share that information with. Are we sending it overseas? And we even need to tell them that if they want to fight with us, they can go to the information regulator. We usually do this in a privacy statement or privacy notice or privacy policy. They are all the same thing. And if you are going to put one thing in place before POPIA kicks in, I would certainly suggest that it is a privacy statement. Security safeguards. Security safeguards says, and that is condition 7, says your organization must implement reasonable technical and organizational measures to make sure that your personal information is confidential and secure. The technical measures are the IT stuff, and that would be things like firewalls and encryption and password and password protection. And Ridwan knows a lot more about that than I do. But you also have to implement organizational common sense measures. If you are going to lock hard copies of documents in a lockable cabinet, the cabinet must lock, the key must only be given to people on a need-to-know basis, and you must actually file the documents. It's very important to consider putting a security compromises policy in place to deal with data breaches. Important to save documents according to a document management system. Important to do awareness as regards the difference between CC and BCC. We've seen data breaches overseas where the CC was used where the BCC should have been used. And the last condition is data subject participation. Our data subjects, again across the board, employees, ex-employees, job applicants, vendors, suppliers, our customers, have got the right to approach us and to ask us free of charge what information do we have about them. Against a prescribed fee, they can ask us for copies of their information. And worst case scenario, if we're no longer authorized to have the information, they can try and exercise their right to be forgotten. And the right to be forgotten is where they say to you, delete everything you have about me. But of course, that right is not absolute. And if your right is stronger to have it, you can absolutely enforce your right to have the data. I see we've got a few questions coming up. We will try our best to get to some questions at the end of the session. Thank you. And then at this point, Ridwan, also because my slides have just once again just frozen, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Ira. Just about to request control from you, so please just bear with me for a second.
And I have approved.
All right, so POPIA also, it's important to bear in mind that POPIA, apart from the 8 conditions for lawfully processing personal information, there's also some specific themes and topics emanating from POPIA, one of which is that of trans-border transfers of information, and that regulates the flow of information outside of South Africa to foreign countries. The other area which POPIA is playing a major role in, which is a massive area of scrutiny for regulators globally, is in the realm of POPIA insofar as it applies to direct marketing. There's also other themes like when is prior authorization required from the regulator in order to process certain types of personal information. But for today's session, because it is quite an abridged talk, probably the most important area and the most important topic emanating from POPIA is the role of the information officer. Why is it important? Because it actually sets the scene for what your compliance program should look like. As I say that, my screen has just frozen as well. But anyway, I'll talk you through the role of the information officer in the meantime. I'll see if our technical team can assist us in the background with getting the slides back up and running. But with POPI, one of the key requirements is that every organization must have an information officer. By default, every private company has its own CEO as the information officer. And that's quite an important thing to note. So if your company has not done anything proactive around POPI compliance, your CEO by default is the information officer of the organization. And your CEO is obliged to ensure that certain mandatory duties are fulfilled when it comes to POPI compliance. For private companies, after much to and fro and back and forth with the information regulator, the regulator has finally acknowledged that the role of the information officer can be delegated to a third party. There's still some questions as to whether or not the role can be delegated to somebody external to the organization. The regulator seems to think that only employees of the company can be an information officer. We have a different view, but I'm not going to go too much into the debates which we're currently having with the regulator. What's important to note is that every organization by default should have an information officer, and by default your CEO is already that information officer or the equivalent officer of that body. Come 1 July or before 1 July, your organization would have to take the proactive step to actually register your information officer. And if you've appointed deputy information officers, then your deputy information officers with the information regulator. So there's an online portal around this. But why is this role so important? The Act, both POPI as well as its sister legislation, POPIA, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, places a number of proactive duties on the information officer. It starts off quite loosely. It says encouraging compliance by the body's organization with the conditions for lawfully processing personal information. And then it gets a bit more specific, dealing with requests made to the body pursuant to POPI. So data subjects have access request rights. They can ask for access to documents or records, correction of documents, deletion of records in certain instances. And your information officer is the party or the person tasked with dealing with those requests within an organization. Next, the information officer will be tasked or is tasked with working with the regulator in relation to investigations. The regulator has quite wide powers. One of the powers which the regulator has is to initiate any sort of inquiries either on a proactive basis or in response to a complaint. And the regulator would actually be tasked with may request information of a company or of a body. If that happens, your information officer is going to be your central point of contact between the information regulator and the organization. And then finally, the Act says that the information officer is tasked with otherwise ensuring compliance by the body. And then the regulations, which come into force on 1 July as well, expands on the role of the information officer. And the regulations then set the scene for what practical steps the organization needs to take in order to become POPI compliant. The wording used here is the information officer must ensure that. So must ensure denotes that it's mandatory, it's compulsory. There's no discretion attached to it. Some of these are quick wins. Others may require some form of time and investment on your part. But I'll go through each of these duties with you. The vast majority are fairly easy to comply with. In fact, all of them are easy to comply with, just depending on the resource commitment of your organization and the time available. We don't have much time for compliance. That being said, we certainly don't suggest that if you're not compliant or if you haven't fulfilled those requirements by 1 July, that you simply stop and do nothing about it. Please do continue with your processes. But let's go through the duties individually as per the regulations. First is a compliance framework needs to be developed, implemented, monitored, and maintained. I'm going to come back to the compliance framework shortly, and I'll also speak to you about some quick wins which you can achieve in putting in place your compliance framework. Next is a personal information impact assessment needs to be done. And this essentially means some form of audit process needs to be undertaken by your company in order to ascertain what types of personal information are you processing, who is it being shared with, where is it being sourced with, do you have proper consents in place? If you don't have consents in place, what other grounds for justification do you have for processing? Is that information being sent outside of the country? Where is it stored? Is it secured enough? So there's quite a detailed assessment which we do with our clients. The culmination of that assessment should be something called a gap analysis and then finally a remediation plan. So you want to be able to assess where you're falling short of compliance, and where you have picked up those gaps, you would want to remediate those. Some of the remediation activities are quick wins, easy to implement. Others may take a bit more time. But as I've mentioned, we certainly don't suggest or advocate that just because you only have 1 month till this 1 July date, that's the end of it. Please do continue with your compliance program before something goes wrong, because as much as we have only 1 month for compliance, it doesn't mean that come 1 July, that's the end of it. Organizations now are either compliant or they're not. You still do have time to remediate. Obviously, you would want to hope that in that period post 1 July, you don't suffer any data breaches or security compromises, or you don't have data subjects knocking on your door, because that could lead to issues with the information regulator. So that's the second step, and that's probably where most of your time is going to be spent when it comes to your POPIA compliance journey. Next slide, please, Ira. The third requirement is that the information officer needs to ensure that there's internal measures developed together with adequate systems to process requests for information. So some of the quick wins which you can put in place is have in place your PIA manual, your manual in terms of the Promotion of Access to Information Act, have in place something called a subject access request policy. So anybody making a request has certainty as to what the process for making the request is, what will happen once the request is made, what are the person's rights should the request be declined for any reason. But that doesn't end it there. You still need to have systems behind to be able to comply with requests. So if you have a request for deletion of records, and if that's a legitimate request for deletion, your systems need to be geared in such a way that you are able to delete specific records without deleting or compromising the integrity of entire databases and the like. Can become a bit tricky in practice, but with time and with introducing something called privacy by design, these should become a lot more easier going forward. Then the next step, which is of critical importance for organizations, is that internal awareness sessions need to be conducted regarding the provisions of the Act, the regulations, etc. One of the most critical aspects of compliance with any law, including POPIA compliance, is training and awareness. And training and awareness has two components. One is training, like today is an example of a training session. Your information officer and your deputy information officers are required by the guidance note to undergo more in-depth training. Your staff should undergo training, but it's more than that. It's also about creating a culture of awareness within your organizations. And you can do that through various mechanisms, putting in place posters in your workplace, sending out reminders around cybersecurity or data privacy, sending out weekly email tips or regular email tips to your staff, putting posters in your workplace. There's a number of ways. You can be quite creative as to how you run your awareness campaigns, but it's all about creating and instilling a culture of awareness within your organization. Next slide, please. Then the last duty is for organizations to have what's called a PIA manual, a manual in terms of the Promotion of Access to Information Act. And this manual needs to detail certain types of information. It should be placed on your website, and you should have a copy at your offices. You may need to lodge it with the Human Rights Commission between now and 1 July, and with the information regulator thereafter. It's not part of your compliance measures would be to assess whether or not that is a requirement on your organization. So those are, in summary, the duties of the information officer. Why is this role again so critical? Because the Act provides for personal liability for the information officer, including jail time of up to 3 years, or a fine or imprisonment. In the case, for example, if there's an enforcement notice and the information officer refuses to comply with the enforcement notice, there's the potential for jail time. There's also liability for obstructing the regulator. And it's essential that if you do appoint your information officer, that you've got a proper contract in place. The guidance note has some suggested wording as to what that contract should look like. We've looked at it. We think there's a lot more that needs to go into your typical information officer appointment letter. And you also should ensure that whoever you've appointed in that role is registered with the information regulator. The information regulator's view is that you can authorize a person within the body of the responsible party to be the information officer. Their view is that such person should be an executive or equivalent position. and such duties should be described in that person's job description. Question mark as to whether that's an absolute requirement. If you are risk averse, and we suggest you comply with the guidance note as is. If you wish to be, or if like us, you are more pragmatic about POPI compliance, you'll note that the information regulator doesn't always get things 100% right. I mean, we still have a lot of respect for their office, and we still defer to their judgment and their views as far as possible. But there are areas where we have professional disagreement with them. And one of the areas is, whether or not an employee actually needs to be appointed as an information officer or not. Further things is that once you've authorized the person to act as as your information officer or deputy information officer, as I mentioned, that needs to be in writing. The document or the terms of appointment should not prohibit the CEO or the MD or the highest ranking person who made the authorization from exercising the power concerned or performing the duty themselves, and it must be capable of being withdrawn or amended at any time. The Information Regulator's Office also has an online portal, and that portal is up and running. There are some glitches with it, but it is a measure, or it is a mechanism for you to register your information officers and your deputy information officers with the Office of the Regulator. Also, as I mentioned, it's expected that information officers receive adequate training and keep abreast with developments under POPIA and POPIA. And this also extends to deputy information officers. There's also a reporting requirement. So once a year, your information officer would be required to submit a report to the Office of the Information Regulator. We do suggest, if you haven't started your POPI compliance journey, the very first thing you need to do is assess, is your CEO the right person? If you are a private body, or should somebody else be fulfilling that role within the organization? Some of our clients have asked us, can the role be outsourced? Question mark around that. As I said, the information regulator's view is it can't be outsourced. I have a bit of a different view, but we rather defer to the more cautious view and accept what the information regulator says for now, unless you're willing to challenge the information regulator on that. I don't suggest you be the first test case for the information regulators or litigation with the information regulator at this point.
So and that is Ridwan. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We've got a question here, and this is a very interesting one. Do you think a dormant SPV should have an information officer? We apply for consents in the name of the company, but it's not active.
Very, very good question. So the dormant SPV has a board of directors. I suppose that that dormant SPV is still submitting their CIPRO returns annually, otherwise they'll be deregistered. If you're under deregistration, then I mean, that's it. Once a company is deregistered, you've got no corporate power left. But if it's just a dormant shell company, you still have directors' information. You still are required to lodge CIPRO returns. You still are required to submit tax returns, even though it may be a null return. So in that instance, you still are engaging in processing activities, and you are processing personal information. My view is, yes, you would still be required to have an information officer. And by default, the CEO would be the information officer. It does get tricky. I mean, we've got one client, for example, they've got over 500 subsidiaries. Not all of those subsidiaries are active. Some companies are actually merely asset holding shell companies and don't have much else. And if you go according to the strict interpretation per the guidance now, every single one of those entities would be required to have an information officer in their own right. Again, gray area with the information officer, whether somebody can serve as an information officer for more than one company. My personal view is there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to. The information regulator seems to have a different view, and their online portal seems to enforce their view. Ira, I'm not sure if you wish to expand on.
Yes, Redwan, I agree with you. I think sometimes we can play with the concept of a dormant SPV maybe not having a head. So the information officer must be the head as defined in POPIA. And if there is no head, then I think we can argue there is no information officer. But a very tricky, sticky topic. We get this asked all the time, and we're trying to find practical solutions here. And the ones which we can play with are like basically check if you can say there's no information processing going on. But like Ridwan said, generally there would be. And the second thing that you could play with a bit is saying there is no head as defined in POPIA. And then, Ridwan, one last question before we move on is, Do you agree that if you authorize somebody else to become the information officer, that the liability remains with the CEO? We know it is the regulator's view.
Yeah.
What is your view on this?
My personal view, I think not. I think the liability lies with whoever the information officer is, and that's my reading of the act. And if somebody else has been appointed to act as the information officer, then that's the person who holds the liability. The information regulator obviously has a very different view to that. And some of our clients have taken a more conservative view to say, whatever the information regulator says, we'll go with it. Other of our clients have said, tell us your view and we'll make a judgment call or a risk call as to whether or not we agree with the information regulator or not. And if we have our question, we do at least have some legal standing. And that brings us to the further role. So having this role of the information regulator and the concept of accountability being the first condition for lawfully processing personal information, that brings us to accountability documentation. And what do companies need to do? A few weeks ago, much to my, I won't say annoyance, but much to my irritation, on a Saturday, I decided to go onto LinkedIn, as I would go on every day. And I saw a post by a gentleman who professes to be an expert in information laws. And he stated that companies don't need policies to comply with POPIA. I was very tempted to get into a social media debate with the person, and I just, I decided not to ruin my weekend, and I left it at that. So, and this is a common question which we are asked of our clients: do we actually need data protection policies? The first condition for lawfully processing personal information is accountability. How do you demonstrate accountability? Appointing your information officer is just one leg of accountability, but you need accountability documentation. You need a statement to the world and to the regulator and to your data subjects to say, we take our obligations seriously, and this is how we go about processing personal information. So that alone forms the first ground why you need policies and procedures. But then the act actually goes on further, and it says in terms of section 109.3, when the regulator is looking at determining a fine, the regulator must consider any failure to operate good policies, procedures, and practices. Further, in terms of section 77H to POPIA, the information regulator may make an assessment whether a body complies with the provisions of the Act, POPIA, and POPIA as well, insofar as its policies and implementation procedures are concerned. POPIA Regulation 4, which I've just gone through with you, also requires that a compliance framework be developed, implemented, monitored, and maintained. Yes, obviously a compliance framework is more than just policies and procedures, but at the heart of a compliance framework is exactly that, policies and procedures. And I'll come back to what a compliance framework should look like shortly. So there's certain must-haves which you should be putting in place between now and 1 July as far as possible. As I said, don't stop. If you haven't gotten there by 1 July, don't stop, don't abandon your process, keep going, because POPIA compliance is something that's going to be ongoing. It's not a once-off event. I'm compliant and that's the end of the matter. It's ongoing, it's living, and as your organization evolves, so too would your compliance requirements. But for now, make sure you've appointed your information officer. If you are collecting or processing personal information, make sure you've put in at the very least a privacy statement. Develop, implement, and maintain a compliance framework. I'm going to come back to a compliance framework and how our POPIA toolkit actually helps to fast track this requirement. Develop your data protection policy, which is your policy statement to the world to say, this is who we are, we comply with POPIA, we take our obligations seriously. You should be conducting your risk assessments, and your risk assessments, there's different methodologies to conducting risk assessments. I've seen some companies employ teams of professionals for literally like 6 months to a year, going through each and every line item of data, and they feel that is the degree to which they wish to meet this requirement. We've adopted a more pragmatic view. Companies are already under compliance burden with laws in South Africa. POPIA has come in a very inopportune time, given that we are under COVID and companies are already under financial pressure. But we can still meet the requirement of conducting a personal impact information impact assessment without having to break the bank or without having to cripple your organization with very detailed audits and the like. But that is a requirement on you. You would also need to ensure that your POPIA manual is put in place, and that needs to go on your website and at your premises as well. Your systems for processing subject access requests should be in place. That's where your subject access request policy becomes in place. You must be conducting awareness and training. As I mentioned, this is at the very least, every staff member should undergo training at least once. The level of training would depend on the level of staff and the level of their processing activities. Like your marketing teams would need a lot more training, for example, in the direct marketing provisions. Your IT teams would need to be a lot more cognizant around things like security safeguards, data retention, and the like. Meanwhile, if you got like factory level staff, they don't really work with IT systems or records to a great degree. That level of awareness should be pitched at a much lower level, much more simple, but still communicating the essence of the message. And you still want to inculcate this culture of awareness within your organization. Then also a mandatory requirement under POPIA is that if you are appointing an operator is a third party who process personal information on behalf of a responsible party, there's a mandatory duty on you to put in place a written operator agreement. Again, depending on whether you are an operator or whether you are the responsible party, that agreement may look a bit different. But it is something as part of your compliance journey, which you should be looking at whether or not you do have operators, and if so, putting in place the requisite agreements. And then finally, in some instances, prior authorization may be required from the regulator. Part of your risk assessment is to ensure or to be able to assess whether or not you do require prior authorization. And if so, there's a process that needs to be followed in terms of the Act. And that brings us to our POPIA toolkit. So as I mentioned, one of the core elements of compliance is ensuring that there's a compliance framework initiated. At its core, a compliance framework needs to be underpinned by policies and procedures. We've, in fact, as far back as 2013, Ira and myself sat down with some leading global experts from around the world. And we actually were the first in South Africa to develop something called a POPIA compliance framework. At its heart, it's policies and procedures, some of which are mandatory, others are strongly recommended, and others are nice to have. So at the very least, your POPIA or your information officer should be empowered with certain tools. Having a copy of legislation in place, that's the given, that's the bare minimum your information officer should have. Having your PIA manual in place, mandatory requirement. Having your personal information sharing policy in place, mandatory requirement, because that's your policy statement to the world to say you are as an organization are accountable, you take compliance seriously, and this is your statement as to how you go about it. Could be a privacy statement, it could be a POPIA policy, doesn't matter what you call it, as long as the essence of it is in place and you are able to demonstrate accountability. A global data protection policy or binding corporate rules, not mandatory. It's nice to have if you do have entities in other countries because it will enable you to share personal information between your organization and those countries. Obviously, you would need to take cognizance of the laws of those countries in place. Website privacy policy, if you are using your website for trading purposes or for charitable donation purposes, it's mandatory to have a website privacy policy in place. If you are using your website to collect information, we would strongly suggest your website has a privacy policy. If you're using it to obtain things like direct marketing consents and the like, strongly suggest that you have website privacy policies in place together with the requisite consent clauses and tick boxes. Obviously, those can't be pre-ticked, but there are measures in which you can adopt to actually ensure that any information you're collecting via your website is actually covered through your website privacy policy. The next policy, a security compromises policy, also referred to sometimes as an incident response plan, not mandatory, but in my mind, probably one of the most critical documents for your company to adopt. So what happens if your company suffers a security compromise? How do you behave? How do you go to the regulator? How do you go to your data subjects? Just yesterday, the president signed into law the Cyber Crimes Act, and although there's no commencement date as yet, but implicitly within POPIA and explicitly in the Cyber Crimes Act, there's also a positive duty to notify the South African Police Services. So your security compromises policy actually drives behavior within your organization. It allocates roles and responsibilities, and it makes your organization aware that if we do suffer a security compromise, this is what we should do to initiate it, because ultimately it culminates in you having to notify your data subjects and notify the information regulator, also implicitly the South African Police Services. And if you're in certain industries like banking, then notify the SARB as well. With your security compromise policy, we also suggest, much like how you have fire drills from time to time, test your policy, run mock or simulated incidents to see whether or not your organization is ready for compliance, and test it all the time, because having the policy in place alone is not going to be sufficient, because there's going to be this proactive duty on you to notify the regulator. The next policy, your subject access request policy, is mandatory. It can be combined with your POPIA manual to a degree. We suggest keeping it separate because it also drives behavior of your staff. Just a quick incident: a few years ago, I was training a company on the East Rand, and they told me of this irate lady who arrived at their premises demanding to see CCTV footage of a particular part of the warehouse because she heard that her husband was up to some shenanigans with somebody the day before. Now, that's an example of a subject access request. Had the organization had policies in place and had the staff been trained on the policy, they would have known to direct the lady to the information officer. The lady would have been required to fill in a form, and the information officer would have then had a period of time to consider the request and either accede to it or decline the request. In this instance, there were no policies in place. There was no training. The staff didn't know what to do. And curiosity naturally led to the lady, a few nosy onlookers, and the receptionist and the security all going to see the CCTV camera, and needless to say, jobs and marriages were lost after that very shortly. So things can go horribly wrong. Then further on with the toolkit, we also include a POPIA self-audit assessment. So some of our clients have opted to do a self-assessment as opposed to getting in external parties to assist. It is mandatory that you conduct some form of assessment, a risk assessment. So probably a very, very useful tool. Your data processor operator contract templates, operator contracts are mandatory. So very strongly suggest that you've got proper contracts in place. Model clauses for your typically encountered contract consent clauses, like your employment contracts and the like. We've drafted those as well. With direct marketing, we always, and generally with consent clauses, we always strongly caution against a one-size-fits-all approach. Always be cognizant of what you are trying to achieve, what type of consent you require, and the like. Data retention policy, one of the requirements of the second element of POPIA compliance is ensuring that you are retaining records for specified periods of time. That's also a requirement emanating from other pieces of legislation. Having a data retention policy in place, strongly recommended. It will help your IT teams and your teams to know how long should they be hanging on to data for, how often should they be deleting, how often should they be purging data, and the like. And then there's a number of other policies. I would say these are nice to have, but they each have a business or a sound reason why we suggest that our clients adopt it. Bring your own device policy, CCTV policy, photography policy, cookie policy, something as simple as a password policy, often overlooked by organizations, a social media policy, because social media is a big touch point which personal information can leak from. Cybersecurity awareness policy and training. Cybersecurity and POPIA compliance go hand in hand with each other. You can't have one without the other. And then we also in our toolkit have included things like sample posters for our awareness programs, a simple list and do's and don'ts, because that guides organizations at a very simple to understand level. This is what we need to do, and this is what we should not be doing. And it helps you with your training and your awareness campaigns as well. Clean desk policy, also quite important if you're still using very paper-based records. And then we also develop bespoke or ready-made policies or checklists, for example, for mergers and acquisitions activities or other similar types of activities. And then a lot of industries are now starting to contemplate putting in place codes of conduct. The credit bureaus have done so. The banking industry is in the process of putting one in place. The press are also looking at a press code. So if you are part of a wider organization, you also want to ensure that you are considering putting in place codes of conduct. And that brings me in summary to elements of a proactive compliance program. At the very least, you need to have executive buy-in and initial training and awareness. Today is a good step. The fact that you are here, that's a great step, but it doesn't end there. You need to appoint and register your information officers and deputy information officers. You need to conduct your preliminary risk assessments and implement your accountability documentation. And that is where something like our POPIA toolkit helps you to fast track implementation, because you don't need to reinvent these policies from scratch. And then ongoing awareness training and monitoring is also critical for the success of any compliance program. There are some specific interventions. None of these may be mandatory, but it does accord with best practice. So relying on technology as part of your risk assessments, change management if you do need to change the way things are working, engaging in privacy by design, using privacy impact assessments, and then a focus on cybersecurity is absolutely essential, because you would need to have to ensure that you have met the security standard safeguards and you have focused on security. So that in a nutshell is what companies need to do in order to get compliant. It is doable. The fact that we've got 1 month left, don't be discouraged. We do have, it can be done with the right advice, with the right advisors, and with a pragmatic approach to compliance as well. It is very doable. And we turn now to our final section of non-compliance, and I'll hand over to Ira now. Thanks.
Reverend, just interestingly enough, while you were speaking, we got a question from Peter, and Peter says some third parties are asking for a certificate of compliance to POPIA. Nowhere in the Act does it state that you need such a certificate, and
No.
you've just gone through the must-haves and so on. Do you want to add something to that?
So I do know of a specific body in South Africa which says that they've got their certification accredited. I saw something from the information regulator recently which says there's no such thing as POPI compliance certification. So there is no such thing. We're not aware of it. It's not, there's nothing which the information regulator will certify. Likewise, under GDPR or any other piece of legislation, nobody can really certify that you are compliant, because compliance is an ongoing thing. So the fact that you're compliant today, in a month from now, you could be non-compliant because you may have changed your business activity. So there isn't such a thing to my knowledge. I have seen one organization out there state that they've got accredited certifications of compliance. In my mind, and even in the regulator's view, I don't see how that is possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Redwan. So non-compliance, what can happen when we don't stick to POPI? Any person, and we'll often see competitors and disgruntled employees, can go to the regulator. The regulator can then try and secure settlement. If no settlement is possible, an investigation can be launched. And if a breach is found, they can issue that naughty notice, an enforcement notice. Non-compliance with an enforcement notice, or committing one of the offences in terms of the Act, like bribing the regulator or trying to bribe the regulator, obstructing the regulator, and so on, can lead to up to 10 years in a nice South African jail, or 10 million rand, or both. And then there is also scope for going to court and suing the responsible party for damages. And interestingly enough, POPI speaks to damages, which of course is money, for patrimonial and non-patrimonial losses. So your patrimonial losses would obviously be your monetary losses, but POPI specifically recognizes those softer American-style damages, such as emotional loss, shock, defamation, and so on. And Redwan, do you want to touch on hidden costs before we try and take a few questions?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. So a lot of the literature which you read about POPI, you read about fines and penalties, and a lot of scare stories around fines and penalties. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's not the complete picture. A few years ago, there was a company called Equifax, which suffered a series of data breaches globally. And in their CEO's report, he mentioned that the cost of non-compliance was close to $2 billion. The fines themselves were only a few $100 million. So where did the hidden costs of non-compliance come into play? First, there was remediation costs. So if you are found to have done something wrong, or if you have not complied, or if you've not remediated certain shortcomings in your compliance, remediating those does come at a cost. If the regulator issues an enforcement notice against you, complying with that enforcement notice comes at a cost. Bear in mind, if you don't, or if you refuse to comply with an enforcement notice, your information officer faces personal jail time or a fine. You may also need to retrain your workforce, because with adopting new remediation measures, new compliance steps, new compliance requirements, or new enforcement notice, it may be a case that your staff need to be retrained, or your staff haven't been properly trained or sufficiently trained. That comes at a cost. I recently read a report which suggests that where a company has been found to suffer a data breach, and bear in mind all data breaches are reportable, on average, so the average fall in shareholder value is 7% of the share price. So you can imagine as a company executive, you suffer a data breach, word gets to market, and 7% of your shareholder value is destroyed purely because you've not put certain things in place. That is significant and that is staggering. I mean, if your company is worth several hundred billions, you can just imagine what that amounts to in monetary terms. I don't see your shareholders being too pleased. I can't see your CEO being too pleased. So if you think compliance is costly, non-compliance is a lot more costly. Then there's further costs. If you do suffer a data breach, you need to remediate those data breaches. You need to call in cybersecurity experts. You may need to bring in investigators. You may need to bring in PR agencies, because one of the mandatory duties is to communicate with your data subjects. You'll also need lawyers to couch everything in privacy and to guide you through the process of dealing with the information regulator. So those costs can be significant and staggering. And then there's also potential for class action lawsuits as well. And then finally, your reputational loss is unquantifiable. If you are front page of the Sunday Times and there's a big story about how you failed to secure information or how you failed to comply with legislation, knowing that this legislation was coming, you can only imagine how your company's reputation is going to suffer. And that brings us to the end of today's discussion. I think we do have time for 1 or 2 questions, Ira.
Absolutely, Ridwan. So the first one was, we an adult education company, we only have names and emails and phone numbers. Do we need the person's consent to process that information? It depends on what you're doing with that information. Generally, you don't need consent unless it is special personal information or information of children, or you want to do direct marketing. But I do see that you talk about sending them emails or WhatsApp, which may very well be electronic direct marketing, regulated under Section 69. Then we've got, is information only personal information if it can be linked to an identifiable person? Absolutely. So somebody used the example name Ira. You won't identify who that is, but if you add Ira Gunning, that could possibly become personal information. Absolutely. Unless it is linked to an identifiable person, it would usually be de-identified data, and POPI will not apply. And then Ridwan, an interesting one, can we report somebody to the information regulator for not using BCC? Absolutely, if it's a security compromise, it depends on the circumstances. We're not saying you always have to use BCC. There are often circumstances where we would be using CC, but right. If you are, for example, sharing information with a lot of strangers and you're using the BCC, not the CC button, it certainly can be a security compromise.
Right. And any person can lodge a complaint with the regulator as well.
Absolutely. And Ridwan, one more for you. Yeah. If there are more than one registered entities in South Africa with the same CEO, can the CEO be registered as an IO for both?
Very, very good question. The short answer is yes. There's a big but. The information regulators portal, apparently I haven't been on it, but from my the members of my team who have been on it, and some of our clients have complained to say that once somebody's been registered as an information officer and the details are loaded, they struggle to register them as information officers for other entities as well. It's again something which we hope the information regulator will address. But in my mind, there's absolutely no reason. If your CEO is by default the information officer, then if your CEO is the CEO of 10 companies, that does happen. I mean, I in my own right, I'm a director of more than one company. I'm the CEO of probably 3 organizations. Through my various activities. So that makes me the information officer of all of those entities by default. And if I have employees, who do I then appoint as the information officer?
Yeah, absolutely. Quite a few of our clients have complained that once the identity number is entered into the portal, then you can't use it again. In those instances, you may want to consider registering for one entity and then doing a manual application for the other entity. But I am aware of the fact that if you try and do the manual applications via the email, you generally get a message back saying use the portal. And when you go onto the portal, it says to you, your ID number has already been used. In those circumstances, I would suggest that you send the second application or third application, or how many you may have, to the information regulator via registered post. The address is included in the guidance note. And I think at this point, we've got about 1 minute to go. Thank you so much for joining us. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Ridwan or to me, and we'll try our best to respond to any questions that are sent to us. Thank you very much, and we wish you the best of luck with your POPIA compliance. And please bear in mind that this really is a journey. It is not a race. So if you are not going to be fully compliant by the 1st of July, then please at least try and do as much as you can towards compliance, knowing that it's not going to end on the 1st of July. It's not Y2K. We are going to have to continue with our compliance efforts.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining us, and look forward to further interactions and engagement with all of you.
Thank you.